Hey everyone, today we're talking about something absolutely crazy. Why kings and queens had zero privacy in their bedrooms. Forget what Disney movies show. The real story is wild, and trust me, nobody would want to live like this for even one day. So hit that like button if you want to learn weird history stuff, and tell me in the comments where to watch from. Now, get comfy, maybe grab some snacks, and let's jump into the weirdest bedroom stories ever. Because what I'm about to tell isn't just strange, it's completely insane. The more powerful someone was back then, the less privacy they had. We're talking about people who could start wars with a single word, but couldn't even take a nap alone. And before we dive deep into this rabbit hole, let me just say, this isn't some exaggerated Hollywood nonsense. This is real history, documented by dozens of court officials, ambassadors, and nobles who lived through it. The stuff we're about to explore actually happened, day after day, year after year, for centuries. The King of France. He has all the power in the world. He owns a palace so massive it has over 2,000 rooms. He controls the lives of millions of people. He can declare war, make peace, or have someone executed with a snap of his fingers. Surely someone with that much power can get some privacy in his own bedroom, right? Wrong. So incredibly wrong. The king wakes up in the morning at exactly 8 a.m., not because he wants to, but because that's when the court schedule demands it. And before he even opens his eyes, before he's even fully conscious, there are already 12 people standing in his bedroom. Not because something terrible happened, not because there's a national emergency, not because enemy armies are at the gates, just because it's Tuesday morning, and this is how royalty lives. This insane ritual was called the lever du roi, which literally just means the king getting up. But calling it getting up is like calling a three-ring circus some entertainment. The king's morning routine became like a TV show that everyone in the palace had to watch, analyze, and take notes about. The king couldn't even scratch himself or yawn without people writing it down and discussing what it might mean for the kingdom. And here's the part that will blow my mind. These weren't just servants or palace staff doing their jobs. These were dukes, counts, marquises, and other incredibly rich, powerful people who actually fought each other, sometimes literally, for the chance to watch the king get dressed. We're talking about grown men with massive estates and ancient family names who would pay enormous bribes and make complex political deals just to be the guy who gets to hand the king his underwear. Think about that for a second. Imagine if today, the richest people in the country, think Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and every major CEO, all fought over who gets to watch the president put on his pajamas. And not just once, but every single day. That's essentially what happened in the most powerful court in Europe, La Toya. But wait, it gets so much worse. This wasn't just a morning thing that lasted 30 minutes and then everyone went about their business. This was the king's entire existence, every single day, from the moment he opened his eyes until the moment he closed them, and sometimes, even when he was trying to sleep. Let me paint a detailed picture of what the royal bedroom actually looked like, because understanding the physical space makes this whole story even more unbelievable. The king's bedroom at Versailles, and we're focusing on Versailles because it was the gold standard for royal courts across Europe, was like a train station with fancy decorations. But imagine a train station where everyone's there to stare at one specific person. The bed itself was positioned exactly like a stage in a theater. There was actually a golden fence, called a balustrade, separating the bed from what can only be described as audience seating. Yes, audience seating. In the bedroom. Because apparently watching someone sleep was considered prime entertainment in the 17th and 18th centuries. The room was absolutely massive. We're talking about a space bigger than most people's entire houses today. The ceiling soared 30 feet above, painted with elaborate scenes of mythological gods and goddesses who, ironically, probably had more privacy than the king did. But here's the thing about that huge space. Big doesn't mean private. It just meant more room for more people to stand around and watch the king exist. The walls were covered in tapestries that cost more than most people earned in their entire lifetimes. These weren't just decorations, they were works of art, depicting hunting scenes, pastoral landscapes, and images of the kind of outdoor freedom the king would never actually experience. But guess what? Behind those beautiful, expensive wall hangings were secret alcoves and hidden passages where even more people could hide and spy on the king without being seen. And the smell in this room? Imagine a mixture of the most expensive perfumes money could buy, all desperately trying to mask the odor of hundreds of people who bathed maybe once a month if they were lucky. Add to that the lingering scent of whatever entertainment happened in the room the night before, plus the musty smell of those enormous wigs everyone wore, basically elaborate constructions of hair, powder, and pomade that hadn't been properly cleaned in weeks. The noise level was constant and overwhelming. Everyone could hear everything. People whispering and gossiping about every single thing the king did. The constant rustling of silk gowns and velvet coats as people moved around trying to get better positions. The endless scratching of quill pens as secretaries and courtiers wrote down notes about the king's life. And the general buzz of dozens of conversations happening simultaneously. The king coughed twice this morning. Write that down. It might be significant. He turned to his left side when he slept last night. Last Tuesday, he turned right. Something must have changed in the political situation. He's breathing differently today. Alert the physicians immediately. Did you notice how he looked at the Duke of Orleans? There might be tension there. This was the soundtrack of the king's life. Every single day, from dawn until dusk. Now the king is awake, and trust me, he's definitely fully awake, because sleeping through that level of noise and activity is absolutely impossible. Time to get dressed. In private? What's that concept? The king couldn't put on his own shirt, not because he was physically incapable, but because doing so would be considered deeply disrespectful to his royal status and would upset the entire social and political order that kept the kingdom functioning. Instead, there was an incredibly complex, rigid hierarchy that determined exactly who got to touch which piece of the king's clothing. This system was more complicated than modern international trade agreements and more sensitive than nuclear disarmament negotiations. The duke of this province gets the honor of handing the king his chemise. That's his undershirt, for those keeping track at home. The count of that territory gets the privilege of presenting his stockings. The marquis of some other place brings his breeches. Someone else, probably fighting off 3 other nobles with their elbows and political maneuvering, gets the coveted position of presenting his coat. Each piece of clothing represented a different level of intimacy with the royal person, and therefore a different level of political power and social prestige. But here's where this whole system becomes absolutely ridiculous. If someone with a higher rank walked into the room while the king was in the middle of getting dressed, everything stopped. Dead stop. The person currently helping the king had to immediately hand over whatever piece of clothing they were holding to the more important person. The king could be standing there half naked in the middle of winter for 20 or 30 minutes, while dukes and counts argued about precedence and who had the right to put the royal pants on. And the king couldn't complain. He couldn't say, hey, maybe I'll just put on my own socks today and we can all get on with running the country. That would cause a scandal so massive it would be talked about for years. The entire social system would be thrown into chaos, Important people would be insulted, political alliances would crumble, wars might even start over such a breach of protocol. But let me tell you about all the insane stuff that happened before anyone even got to the clothing part, because the morning routine was even more elaborate than most people realize. First, someone had to officially announce and confirm that the king was awake. Not just awake in the normal human sense, but awake in the proper, royal, ceremonial manner that befitted his divine status. Then they had to carefully inspect his bed to make sure he had slept in a way that was appropriate for a king. Yes, they actually studied how the king slept, what position his body was in, and what his bed sheets looked like, searching for hidden meanings and political significance. Did the king sleep restlessly, tossing and turning? Obviously, he must be deeply worried about some aspect of governing the kingdom. Are the sheets particularly rumpled on one side? He must be favoring certain political factions or considering changes in policy. Did he sleep soundly and peacefully? Perhaps he's becoming too detached from the serious concerns and problems facing his people. The king literally could not win this game. Every possible way he could sleep was interpreted as having some deeper meaning for the state of the kingdom. Then came the incredibly complex process of selecting the king's clothing for the day. This wasn't a quick 5-minute, what should I wear today decision. This was essentially a political strategy session disguised as getting dressed. The color of the king's jacket could send a subtle message about his current feelings toward foreign policy. The style of his buttons might indicate his stance on domestic issues. The choice between emerald cufflinks and sapphire ones could accidentally start a diplomatic incident because some ambassador from another country felt slighted by the jewelry choice. Every single morning, the king was essentially playing a complex game of political chess, using his wardrobe as the board, and every single person in that room was trying to outmaneuver everyone else. Now, let's talk about something that most polite history documentaries conveniently skip over. What happened when the king needed to use the bathroom? And trust me, this is where the complete absence of privacy becomes truly mind-blowing. Everyone today knows how much people value privacy in the bathroom. It's considered one of the most basic, fundamental human needs for personal space. Well, forget about all of that. Even the king's most private, intimate bodily functions were treated as public events that required audiences, witnesses, and detailed record-keeping. The royal toilet was called a chaise percée, which sounds fancy in French, but was basically just an elaborate chair with a hole cut in the seat and a chamber pot positioned underneath. And yes, the king used this contraption while people watched him. Not just any people. Important people, powerful people, people who were taking detailed notes about every aspect of the experience. There was actually an official court position called the groom of the stool. And yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. Someone's entire job, their whole career, was to assist the king with and observe his bathroom activities. This wasn't considered a demeaning or embarrassing position. Quite the opposite, actually. It was one of the most trusted, intimate, and politically powerful roles in the entire palace, because that person had exclusive access to the king during his most vulnerable moments. Think about that for a second. In our modern world, people won't even answer their phones while they're in the bathroom. We consider it the ultimate private space. But the king of the most powerful nation in Europe had full audiences of nobles, ministers, and court officials for his most basic biological needs. And the conversations that took place during these moments? Critical government business. Seriously. Some of the most important political decisions in European history were made while kings were sitting on fancy toilet chairs. discussing matters of war and peace with ministers and advisors who were standing around watching and waiting. Your Majesty, we need to discuss the deteriorating situation with Spain. Not right now, I'm trying to concentrate on the task at hand. But sire, the Spanish ambassador is demanding an immediate response to their latest proposal, and the trade negotiations are falling apart. Fine. Tell him we'll accept their terms for now, but we'll renegotiate next spring. Now please, hand me that cloth and let's discuss the details after I'm finished. This was actual diplomacy in the age of absolute monarchy. International relations conducted in the royal bathroom. But it gets even more invasive. Court physicians would analyze everything about the king's bathroom visits, frequency, duration, apparent level of comfort or discomfort, looking for signs of illness or changes in health. They believed they could predict everything, from the king's mood to the kingdom's future prosperity, based on his digestive patterns. And if the king seemed to be taking longer than usual, that became a matter of state concern. Was he ill? Was he contemplating important decisions? Was he perhaps meeting secretly with hidden advisors? Even the most basic human functions became subjects of political analysis and court intrigue. Think the morning routine was bad? Wait until you hear about dinner time. And yes, the king often ate his meals in his bedroom because, apparently, the idea of eating in peace somewhere else was just too radical to consider. The king never, ever ate alone. Not once. Not even when he was sick, stressed, or dealing with major crises. His meals were elaborate performances, carefully choreographed shows where his bedroom frequently doubled as a dining room, because even his nutrition and eating habits had to be monitored and analyzed by the court. Picture this scene. The king is sitting at an ornate table, trying to enjoy his incredibly fancy food, and we're talking about meals that were more elaborate than most modern wedding receptions. Roasted peacocks stuffed with exotic herbs, swans prepared in complex sauces, dishes with ingredients imported from around the world, wines that cost more than most people's annual income. Every meal had 15 to 20 courses, each one more extravagant than anything most people could imagine. And while the king is attempting to eat this feast, there are literally hundreds of people standing around watching him chew. They're not just casually observing, they're intensely studying every aspect of his eating experience. Which foods does he eat first? How much does he consume of each dish? Does he add salt or seasoning? How does he hold his fork? What facial expressions does he make when tasting different items? They're probably even placing bets on whether he'll finish his vegetables. His Majesty seems particularly fond of the roasted bird today. Make note of that. It might indicate his approval of the new trade agreements with the southern provinces. He's using the golden fork instead of the silver one. What could that signify? Should we alert the foreign ambassadors? Look, he just smiled slightly while eating the fish course. Perhaps he's pleased with the naval reports from the Atlantic Fleet. Wait. He's frowning at the soup. This could be serious. Cancel all scheduled diplomatic meetings with the Dutch representatives until we understand what this means. Every single bite was treated as a political statement. Every sip of wine was analyzed for hidden meanings. The king couldn't even add salt to his food without someone interpreting it as commentary on domestic policy or international relations. And the conversations that were expected to happen during these meals? Imagine trying to have a romantic dinner with a spouse while 100 people stand around analyzing every word that's spoken. Imagine attempting to discipline children or discuss family matters while court officials take detailed notes on parenting techniques and family dynamics. The king couldn't even have a normal, private conversation with his wife, because everyone in the room was listening intently and would probably be gossiping about it before he finished his soup. The royal marriage wasn't just a personal relationship, it was a public institution, and every interaction between the king and queen was scrutinized for signs of political alliances, succession concerns, or diplomatic implications that might affect the entire kingdom. But here's something that makes the dinner situation even more absurd. The king wasn't allowed to show preferences too obviously. If he enjoyed one dish significantly more than others, that could be interpreted as favoring the region where that food came from. If he didn't finish something, it might insult the chef, the supplier, or even an entire province. The simple act of eating became a complex diplomatic balancing act. And now we come to the really awkward part of this story. Let's discuss what happened when the king and queen wanted some intimate time together. And yes, we absolutely have to go there, because this is where the complete absence of privacy reaches levels that are almost impossible to believe. Anyone with common sense would assume this would be the one moment when everyone would respectfully leave the room, right? The one time when basic human decency would prevail and people would say, you know what? Maybe we should give the royal couple some private space for this very personal activity. Wrong. So incredibly, unbelievably wrong. When it came time for the royal couple to fulfill their dynastic duties, and yes, that's actually what the court officially called it, because even the most intimate aspects of marriage couldn't just be called by normal names when royalty was involved, the bedroom didn't empty out. If anything, it became more crowded than usual. Why? Because producing an heir to the throne was considered the most serious business in the entire kingdom. The future of the monarchy, the stability of the government, and the continuation of the royal bloodline all depended on the royal couple successfully creating the next generation. So, naturally, witnesses were absolutely required to make sure everything was conducted properly and legitimately. Picture this incredibly uncomfortable scene. The king is attempting to be romantic and intimate with his wife, and there's an entire crowd of rich nobles, high-ranking church officials, court physicians, and various other dignitaries literally standing around the bed like spectators at a sporting event, waiting to observe and officially confirm that, yes, the royal couple is actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. Talk about performance pressure that would make anyone completely unable to function. But the situation was even more invasive and humiliating than that. The witnesses weren't just there to give a general confirmation that the act took place. They were there to verify in excruciating detail that no trickery, deception, or artificial assistance was involved in the process. No substitutions of people, no fake activities, no outside help from anyone else. They needed to be able to swear under oath in a court of law that the future heir to the throne was conceived legitimately by the actual, verified royal couple, without any interference or manipulation. In some cases, particularly when there were serious questions about succession rights or legitimacy concerns, these witnesses would even conduct detailed examinations of the bedsheets afterward as additional proof and evidence. Yes, that's right. The most private, intimate moments of the royal marriage became physical evidence in legal proceedings that could determine the fate of the entire kingdom. And this invasive witness system wasn't limited to just conception activities. When the queen went into labor to give birth, there were sometimes dozens of official witnesses crowded into the delivery room to verify that the baby actually emerged from the queen's body and wasn't secretly switched with someone else's child during the process. Royal births were treated like major public events, with audiences larger than most theatrical performances or concerts. The French court was particularly notorious for taking this to extreme levels. When Marie Antoinette gave birth to her first child, so many people crowded into the room to witness the event that she nearly suffocated from the poor air circulation and lack of oxygen. The room was packed beyond capacity, with nobles, government officials, servants, curiosity seekers, and anyone else who could claim they had a legitimate reason to be there, all pushing and shoving to get a better view of the Queen during one of the most painful and vulnerable moments of her life. Think about that for a moment. One of the most excruciating, dangerous, and intensely personal experiences a woman can go through, and it's treated like a public spectacle with ticket sales. Even when the king finally managed to get everyone out of his room and attempted to get some rest, the concept of privacy still didn't exist in any meaningful way. The royal bedroom doors didn't have locks. They couldn't have locks. Installing locks on the doors to the king's bedroom would be interpreted as a sign of paranoia, weakness, or worse, evidence that the king was planning to conduct secret activities or meet with hidden conspirators. Anyone with sufficient rank and a halfway decent excuse could walk into the king's bedroom at any time, day or night, for virtually any reason they could think of. Someone always needed to check on the king's health every few hours throughout the night, to make sure he was still breathing and hadn't been assassinated in his sleep. Someone else inevitably had urgent news that probably could have waited until morning but somehow always required immediate royal attention. Another person just wanted to make sure the king hadn't been murdered by hidden enemies. Someone needed to adjust the fire in the fireplace to maintain the proper temperature. Yet another courtier wanted to officially confirm that the king was sleeping in the appropriate royal position and manner. The king essentially slept with one eye open because he never knew when some duke or minister was going to burst through the doors with critically important news about tax collection problems or minor border disputes that could definitely have waited until reasonable morning hours but somehow always demanded instant royal attention and decision-making. And if the king talked in his sleep, every mumble, every word, every sound he made while unconscious was carefully analyzed like it contained prophetic visions of the kingdom's future. The king said cheese 3 times during the night. He must want us to declare war on Switzerland and seize their dairy production. Keith was tossing and turning more than usual. The situation in Hungary must be weighing heavily on his mind. We should prepare military advisors. He called out "Mother" while dreaming. This clearly suggests he's reconsidering the terms of the treaty with Austria. Alert the foreign ministry immediately. Even the king's dreams and unconscious mind became matters of national security and political analysis. Court physicians would study his sleeping patterns, breathing rhythms, and nighttime movements for signs of illness, stress, or changes in mental state. Court astrologers and fortune tellers would interpret his sleep behavior for omens and predictions about the kingdom's future, prosperity, or potential disasters. But here's something that makes the sleep situation even more impossible. The king couldn't even choose when to go to bed. His bedtime was determined by the court schedule, ongoing diplomatic obligations, and the demands of nobles who wanted access to him for various political and social reasons. If important visitors arrived late in the evening from distant provinces or foreign countries, the king couldn't simply say, "I'm exhausted, we'll meet first thing tomorrow morning." He was required to be available, alert, and properly presented whenever duty called, regardless of his personal fatigue or need for rest. Chronic sleep deprivation was just another sacrifice the king was expected to make for the privilege of wearing the crown. Here's something that will really blow minds. Privacy wasn't just missing from royal life. It was actually considered dangerous and potentially treasonous. Wanting privacy was basically equivalent to admitting guilt for crimes against the state. If the king tried to have private conversations with anyone, people immediately assumed he was plotting against his own government or conspiring with enemies. If he wanted to eat a meal alone, that was clear evidence that he was hiding something treasonous or planning secret activities. If he dismissed courtiers from his bedroom or requested time alone, that was obviously proof that he was planning to overthrow his own monarchy or conducting clandestine meetings with foreign spies and saboteurs. Privacy automatically meant suspicion. The more the king wanted it, the more dangerous and disloyal he appeared to everyone around him. So he was forced to live his entire existence like an open book, with every single page being read simultaneously by hundreds of people, all of whom were constantly looking for signs of weakness, disloyalty, secret plotting, or evidence that he was planning something that could threaten the stability of the kingdom. The king couldn't trust anyone because literally everyone was watching everyone else. His closest friend might be secretly taking detailed notes about his bathroom habits to sell information to political enemies. His own personal servants were probably spying for rival nobles, foreign governments, or ambitious courtiers looking to advance their own positions in the complex hierarchy of court politics. It was like living in the world's most luxurious prison, where the bars were made of social expectations and rigid protocols, and the guards were wearing silk clothing and diamond-encrusted accessories. But let me explain why this insane system existed in the first place. Because understanding the reasoning behind it makes the whole situation even more horrifying and tragic. The theoretical justification was that a king who lived his entire life in public view couldn't possibly be corrupted by secret influences or hidden manipulation. If every conversation was overheard by witnesses, every meal was observed by court officials, and every decision was made in front of multiple people, then the king couldn't be secretly controlled by foreign powers, domestic conspirators, or other threats to the stability of the monarchy. In reality, this system accomplished exactly the opposite of its intended purpose. Kings became increasingly isolated, paranoid, and emotionally dependent on the very courtiers who were supposedly protecting them from corruption and outside influence. They couldn't form genuine relationships with anyone, couldn't trust their own family members, and couldn't make decisions based on their actual judgment and wisdom, because every choice had to be carefully filtered through the expectations and reactions of their constant audience. The system that was designed to prevent corruption actually created a completely different and more insidious kind of corruption: the systematic destruction of basic human dignity, personal autonomy, and psychological well-being. Let's take a step back from all the bizarre details and "can believe this actually happened" moments and talk about the real human beings who were forced to live these lives. Because behind all the absurd protocols and unbelievable situations, there were actual people with normal human emotions, needs, fears, hopes, and desires, just like everyone else. Imagine never having a single moment alone with thoughts and feelings. Never being able to show genuine emotion without it being immediately dissected, analyzed, and turned into political commentary. Never being able to have an honest, heartfelt conversation with a spouse or children without an audience of dozens of people taking notes and making judgments. Never being able to cry when sad, laugh when happy, or simply exist as a human being without someone constantly analyzing what every expression and gesture means for the future of the country. These weren't just minor inconveniences or slightly annoying social obligations. This was systematic psychological torture that would break even the strongest people. Many royal marriages completely fell apart, not because the couples didn't care about each other or weren't compatible, but because they literally never had a single opportunity to build a genuine, intimate relationship in private. How is it possible to fall in love when every kiss is witnessed and recorded? How can couples resolve conflicts and problems when every argument becomes a matter of public record and political analysis? Mental health and psychological well-being weren't concepts that people understood or prioritized back then, but even the most resilient individuals would eventually crack under this kind of relentless, constant scrutiny and pressure. And many kings and queens did break. They would have very public psychological breakdowns, make increasingly erratic and irrational decisions, or retreat so deeply into their ceremonial roles that they barely seemed like human beings anymore. So, far beyond that of some of the brighter moments that I like to see, such as being vampired, Louis XIV, the famous Sun King who essentially created and perfected this whole system at Versailles, reportedly said later in his life that he felt like he was permanently trapped in a theatrical performance, where he never got to leave the stage, take off the costume, or stop acting. Even he, the person who designed and implemented this elaborate court system, eventually recognized the severe psychological toll it took on everyone involved. Marie Antoinette desperately tried to create small, private spaces within Versailles where she could occasionally escape the constant observation and live like a somewhat normal person, even if just for a few hours at a time. Her little fake village, the Petit Trianon, was her attempt to experience ordinary human activities like gardening, simple meals, and casual conversations without audiences and analysis. But even these modest attempts at privacy were considered scandalous and inappropriate by the French people, who criticized her for wanting to be alone. They saw her desire for normal human experiences as evidence that she was selfish, out of touch with her royal duties, and didn't care about her responsibilities as queen. Think about the tragic irony of that situation. A woman was publicly criticized and eventually hated for wanting to experience the most basic human need for personal space and privacy. Here's the most mind-blowing irony of this entire historical situation. These kings and queens were literally the most powerful people in the entire world, with authority over millions of lives and vast empires, but they had significantly less personal privacy and freedom than the poorest peasants in their kingdoms. A simple farmer could at least close his cottage door at the end of the day and have dinner with his family in peace, sharing stories and affection without anyone watching or taking notes. A village shopkeeper could take a quiet walk alone in the evening to think through problems and clear his mind. A craftsman could work in his shop without an audience analyzing every hammer strike for hidden political meanings. The King of France, the most powerful monarch in Europe, he was essentially a prisoner, trapped in a golden cage with completely transparent walls, unable to experience even the most basic human activities without constant observation and analysis. These rulers could send massive armies into battle with a single command, deciding the fate of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. They could redistribute enormous amounts of wealth, changing the economic fortunes of entire regions. They could determine what religion whole nations would follow, affecting the spiritual lives of millions of people. They could have anyone executed immediately for any reason, wielding the ultimate power of life and death. But they couldn't put on their own shirt in the morning, eat a simple meal without an audience, or have a private conversation with their own children. It makes anyone seriously reconsider what we actually mean when we talk about freedom, power, and success. What's the point of having unlimited authority over other people if we can't use that power to secure the most fundamental human need for personal space and dignity? And this system didn't just affect the kings and queens themselves, it completely shaped the lives of everyone in the royal family. Royal children grew up from birth knowing that absolutely everything they did was being constantly watched, judged, and analyzed for political significance. They never learned how to form genuine friendships or authentic relationships because every single interaction with other people was essentially a performance for an audience. Imagine being a royal child and never being able to play freely and spontaneously. never being able to make normal childhood mistakes in private, never being able to just be a kid exploring the world without someone constantly analyzing what behavior might mean for the future political stability of the kingdom. Now let's flip this story around and consider it from the perspective of all those people who were watching, because they were just as trapped in this insane system as the royalty they were observing. Imagine someone's entire livelihood, social status, family fortune, and personal safety depending completely on their ability to properly observe, interpret, and understand every subtle detail of the king's behavior and mood. Their career success, their children's future, and their family's survival could literally depend on whether they correctly understood the political significance of the king choosing to wear a blue coat instead of a red one on any given morning. These wealthy nobles and court officials weren't just perverted voyeurs getting entertainment from watching the king get dressed and use the bathroom. They were participants in an incredibly complex, high-stakes political system where access to information about the king's health, preferences, thoughts, and intentions was more valuable than money. Knowledge was literally power, and the most valuable knowledge was intimate details about the king's private life and personal habits. If someone was a duke and happened to notice that the king seemed unusually tired during his morning dressing routine, that information could be worth an enormous fortune to other courtiers who were trying to decide whether it was a good time to approach the king with requests for favors or political appointments. If they observed that the queen appeared upset or distracted during dinner, that intelligence could help them navigate the dangerous waters of court politics for weeks or even months. But this also meant that these observers could never relax, never let their guard down, never stop being on and performing their roles in this elaborate theater. They had to be constantly alert, continuously analyzing every gesture and expression, perpetually ready to interpret signals and read between the lines. One mistake in understanding, one missed signal, one moment of inattention could result in complete political disaster, social ruin, or even physical danger. So while the king and queen were prisoners of their unlimited power, the courtiers were prisoners of their ambition and social climbing, trapped in a system that demanded constant vigilance, perfect performance, and absolute dedication to the art of royal observation. And just like the royalty they served, these nobles couldn't trust anyone either. Every other courtier was a potential rival. Every conversation was a potential trap. Every friendship was a potential source of betrayal. They were all competing with each other for the king's attention and favor, which meant they were simultaneously cooperating in the system while trying to undermine each other's positions. Now, before anyone feels too superior or modern sitting comfortably in their private bedroom, watching this on their personal device, think seriously about this question. How different are we really from those 18th century French courtiers? We voluntarily share our most intimate moments, private thoughts, and personal details on social media platforms for millions of strangers to see and judge. We carry devices in our pockets that track our exact location 24 hours a day, monitor our conversations, record our searches, and analyze our behavior patterns in ways that would make those Versailles spies jealous. We live in a world where privacy is becoming increasingly rare, expensive, and suspicious. The major difference is that we chose this lifestyle. We actively decided to trade our privacy for convenience, entertainment, social connection, and the intoxicating feeling of being famous and important to an audience of followers. Those kings and queens never had any choice in the matter. They were born into a system that had already decided their fate. But think about our modern influencers, celebrities, and politicians. Don't they live in a remarkably similar fishbowl? Every outfit they wear gets analyzed by fashion experts and critics. Every relationship gets scrutinized by gossip magazines and social media commentators. Every mistake, every awkward moment, every human flaw gets broadcast instantly to millions of people around the world. We've essentially created our own version of the royal court system. where public figures voluntarily give up their privacy in exchange for power, influence, and wealth. And what about the rest of us, regular people? How many of us actually have genuine privacy anymore? Our smartphones track everywhere we go, creating detailed maps of our daily routines. Our internet searches are monitored and saved forever, creating psychological profiles that reveal our deepest interests, fears, and desires. Our purchases are analyzed to predict our future behavior. Our social media posts, photos, and comments are preserved permanently, creating a public record of our thoughts and activities that can be accessed by employers, governments, and anyone else who wants to know about us. Maybe we haven't progressed as far from Versailles as we'd like to believe. Maybe we've just replaced the physical courtiers with digital algorithms, and the golden bedroom with virtual spaces where we perform our lives for invisible audiences. But there is still one crucial difference that we should appreciate. We still have the option to turn off our phones, delete our social media accounts, close our curtains, and choose privacy if we really want it. Those kings and queens never had that option, not even for a single moment. This elaborate, invasive system of royal surveillance didn't last forever, of course. The French Revolution in 1789 put a pretty definitive and violent end to the whole living your entire life as a public performance approach to monarchy. It turns out that when ordinary people are literally starving in the streets, dying from diseases that could be prevented with basic medical care, and watching their children suffer from malnutrition, they don't have much patience for elaborate court ceremonies, public bedroom rituals, and the spectacle of nobles fighting over who gets to hand the king his underwear. The revolution wasn't just about economics and politics. It was also a massive rejection of this entire system of royal theater and artificial ceremony. The French people had finally had enough of watching their taxes go toward funding a lifestyle so disconnected from reality that it seemed like something from another planet. But even after the revolution, even after kings and queens started getting their heads chopped off by guillotines, it took centuries for European royalty to learn that maybe, just maybe, a little bit of privacy might actually be a good thing for everyone involved. The British royal family, for example, still struggles today with finding the right balance between public duty and private life. Every royal wedding becomes a global television event watched by millions of people. Every royal birth is announced to the world within hours, with photographers camping outside hospitals for days. Every royal scandal gets dissected by tabloid newspapers and social media commentators who analyze every detail, like those old French courtiers. The only real difference is that now we call it media coverage and public interest instead of court ceremony and royal protocol. But the basic concept is remarkably similar. The most powerful and privileged people in society still live their lives as public performances for mass audiences. What's really fascinating is how this system affected not just the individuals who lived through it, but entire cultures and societies for generations afterward. The French court system at Versailles became the model that other European countries tried to copy. German princes, Italian dukes, Spanish nobles, and Russian aristocrats all attempted to recreate their own versions of this elaborate surveillance system because they thought it represented the height of civilized sophistication and political power. But what they were really spreading was a form of institutionalized psychological torture disguised as elegant culture. They were teaching entire generations of powerful people that privacy was dangerous, that authenticity was weakness, and that every human interaction should be treated as a political performance. The effects of this mindset lasted long after the original system collapsed. Even today, in many cultures around the world, there's still this idea that important people shouldn't expect or want privacy. Politicians, celebrities, and business leaders are expected to live their lives as open books, and any attempt to maintain personal boundaries is seen as suspicious or arrogant. We've inherited this bizarre belief that privacy is something only ordinary people deserve, and that anyone with power or influence should be willing to sacrifice their personal lives for public consumption. Here's something most people don't think about. What was life like for the hundreds of servants who actually had to make this insane system function every day? While everyone focuses on the kings, queens, and nobles, there was an entire underground world of servants, cooks, cleaners, and workers who knew more about the royal family's real lives than anyone else. These people saw everything: the genuine emotions, the private arguments, the moments of weakness and humanity that couldn't be hidden from the people who emptied chamber pots and changed bed sheets. The servants developed their own complex system of secrets, gossip, and information trading. They knew which nobles were having affairs, which ministers were plotting against each other, and which members of the royal family were actually kind versus those who were cruel when no courtiers were watching. But these servants were also trapped in the system. They could never speak openly about what they witnessed, because doing so would mean instant dismissal, imprisonment, or worse. They had to pretend they were invisible, that they didn't hear the private conversations or see the human moments. In many ways, the servants had more real power than the nobles, because they had genuine information about what was actually happening behind all the ceremony and theater. But they could never use that power without destroying their own lives. Let's talk about something that often gets overlooked: the incredible cost of maintaining this system of constant surveillance and ceremony. Running the court at Versailles required thousands of employees. There were hundreds of nobles who needed to be housed, fed, and entertained. There were servants, guards, cooks, cleaners, musicians, artists, and craftspeople. The cost of maintaining all these people, plus the elaborate ceremonies, the fancy clothes, the expensive food, and the massive palace itself, was absolutely staggering. Some historians estimate that the French court consumed between 25% and 40% of the entire national budget. While ordinary people were struggling to afford bread, the government was spending enormous amounts of money on the privilege of watching the king get dressed. This wasn't just waste. This was waste on a scale that's almost impossible to comprehend. The money spent on a single royal dinner could have fed entire villages for months. The cost of one elaborate court ceremony could have built schools, hospitals, or roads that would have benefited thousands of people. But the system continued, because everyone involved had convinced themselves that this elaborate theater was essential for maintaining political stability and royal authority. They believed that if people stopped treating the king like a divine being whose every action was sacred and meaningful, the entire social order would collapse. In reality, the opposite was true. The more money they spent on this artificial system, the more angry and resentful ordinary people became, until eventually the whole thing exploded in revolution. The situation was even worse for royal women, who faced additional layers of scrutiny and control that men didn't experience. Queens and princesses were not only watched constantly like the men, but every aspect of their bodies, their health, and their reproductive capabilities became matters of public concern. Their menstrual cycles were monitored by court physicians. Their eating habits were analyzed for signs of pregnancy. Their clothing choices were examined for evidence of their fertility and maternal fitness. When queens became pregnant, their bodies essentially became public property. Court doctors would examine them regularly in front of witnesses. Their daily activities were severely restricted, Their diets were controlled by committees of physicians and advisors. And as we discussed earlier, when it came time to give birth, the experience became a public spectacle, with audiences of dozens or even hundreds of people. The most painful, dangerous, and intimate experience in a woman's life was treated like a sporting event. But even beyond the physical invasions, royal women faced constant judgment about their personalities, their intelligence, and their worthiness to be mothers of future kings. Every gesture, every word, every facial expression was analyzed for signs of whether they would be good influences on their children. Marie Antoinette, for example, was criticized for everything, from her fashion choices to her friendships to her interest in music and art. People complained that she smiled too much, that she was too interested in entertainment, that she spent too much time with other women, that she wasn't serious enough about her royal duties. The double standard was incredible. Male royalty could have mistresses, drink excessively, gamble away fortunes, and engage in all sorts of questionable behavior, and it was just considered normal masculine behavior. But if a queen showed any sign of having her own personality, interests, or desires, it was treated as a threat to the monarchy. As word of the elaborate French court system spread across Europe, other royal families began trying to copy and adapt it for their own countries. But most of them didn't understand that the system only worked, and even that's debatable, because of France's unique political and economic situation. The Russian court under Catherine the Great tried to implement similar protocols. But Russian culture was fundamentally different from French culture, and the results were often ridiculous rather than impressive. German princes attempted to recreate Versailles-style ceremonies in much smaller palaces, which meant that the same number of people were crammed into much tighter spaces, making the whole thing even more claustrophobic and uncomfortable. English royalty looked at the French system and decided it was too extreme, but they still adopted modified versions of public ceremonies and limited privacy. The Spanish court tried to combine French protocols with their own traditions, creating hybrid systems that satisfied nobody. What's interesting is that in every case, these attempts to copy the French system contributed to political instability rather than strengthening royal authority. People in other countries saw their rulers adopting these expensive, artificial ceremonies and began questioning whether their leaders were more interested in playing dress-up than actually governing effectively. The system that was supposed to demonstrate royal power and divine authority actually made monarchs appear weak, out of touch, and obsessed with meaningless rituals rather than real leadership. So what can we learn from this bizarre chapter in human history? What does this tell us about power, privacy, and human nature? First, it shows us that privacy isn't just a nice luxury. It's a fundamental human need that's essential for psychological health and authentic relationships. When people are deprived of privacy, they become anxious, paranoid, and unable to form genuine connections with others. Second, it demonstrates that systems of constant surveillance, even when they're justified as being for security or transparency, often end up creating more problems than they solve. The elaborate French court system was supposed to prevent corruption and conspiracy, but it actually made the monarchy more isolated and out of touch than ever before. Third, it reveals how easy it is for people to convince themselves that artificial, meaningless ceremonies are actually important and necessary. The courtiers at Versailles genuinely believed that watching the king get dressed was vital work that served the kingdom. They had created an entire worldview based on the idea that these elaborate rituals had deep significance. And finally, it shows us that even the most powerful people in the world can become prisoners of the systems they create or inherit. The kings and queens at Versailles had theoretically unlimited authority, but in practice they were trapped by expectations, protocols, and traditions that they couldn't change without risking their positions. So there we have it, the complete, unbelievable, and ultimately tragic story of why royal bedrooms had absolutely no privacy. This wasn't just a quirky historical curiosity or an amusing anecdote about the weird things people used to do in the past. This was a systematic destruction of human dignity and personal autonomy that affected thousands of people over several centuries. The next time anyone closes their bedroom door and experiences that wonderful moment of being truly alone with their thoughts, take a second to appreciate that simple luxury. It's something that the most powerful people in history, people who could start wars, redistribute wealth, and control the lives of millions, could only dream about. The next time someone complains about the lack of privacy in our modern world, with our social media surveillance and digital tracking, remember that at least we still have choices. We can turn off our phones, delete our accounts, close our curtains, and choose solitude when we need it. Those kings and queens never had that option, not even for a single moment in their entire lives. But maybe most importantly, this story should make us think carefully about the systems and expectations we create in our own time. Are we building societies that respect human dignity and personal autonomy? Or are we creating new versions of Versailles, where people are expected to live their lives as performances for others? What do people think? Could anyone handle living like those French royals? Which part of this story surprised you the most? Did you know about the witnessed royal intimacy? Were shocked by the bathroom audiences? The dinner theater? The complete inability to ever be alone? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed diving into this weird corner of history, make sure to subscribe for more stories about the strange realities behind the fairy tales we tell ourselves about the past. Also, tell me what other aspects of royal life would like me to explore. The bizarre medical practices, the insane eating customs, the completely ridiculous fashion rules. There's so much more strange history to uncover, and so many more stories about how the most privileged people in history were often the most trapped. Until next time, enjoy privacy while having it. Appreciate the freedom to be alone with thoughts, and remember that it's more precious than any crown, any palace, or any amount of power. Trust me, after learning about life at Versailles, that simple ability to close a door and be truly alone feels like the greatest luxury in the world.